to real history. Was the Black Death just a tragedy, or the first biological weapon in history? The Black Death. When the world almost ended, a tale of plague, faith, and the collapse of the medieval order. The year was 1346, and in a sun-baked camp outside the fortress walls of Kaffa in Crimea, a Mongol warrior lay dying. His body was covered in the terrible swellings that had begun to appear among the troops of Khan Janibeg. Grotesque black bulges in his groin and armpits, each one the size of an apple, each one a death sentence written in his own festering flesh. He would not survive the night, nor would the 10,000 others already felled by the same mysterious affliction. The siege of Kaffa had dragged on for months, a slow strangulation of the Genoese trading port by the golden horde of the Khan. But Janibeg had not reckoned with an enemy more formidable than any Christian defender, an invisible killer that swept through his army with the inevitability of fate itself, indifferent to the strength of his soldiers or the power of his throne. The Khan, watching his army crumble from within, made a decision born of desperation and a terrible cunning. If the disease would not obey him, perhaps he could use it as a weapon. By the summer of 1347, Genoese merchants, their trading post becoming a graveyard, loaded their ships with whatever treasures they could salvage and fled westward across the Black Sea. Some of them were sick. They could not have known it, but in the holds of their 12 galleys, beside cargoes of spices and silk, they carried something far more valuable and infinitely more deadly: the seeds of a plague that would remake the entire world. They were carrying death itself. The sea journey would take weeks. The merchants, huddled below decks in the sweltering heat, had no way of knowing that invisible creatures, tiny black fleas, no larger than a grain of rice, were nesting in the fur of rats that scurried through the ship's hold. And those fleas, those insignificant specks of life, carried within their bodies a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, a killer so efficient, so perfectly adapted to human destruction, that it would make conquerors and saints seem powerless. When the ships approached Constantinople in the summer of 1347, watchmen on the harbor walls saw the vessels approaching with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The docks were crowded, as always, with merchants eager for news and goods. But as the ships drew closer, a terrible smell reached the shore. The stench of decay, of human waste, of bodies kept too long in the heat. On the decks of the lead galley, sailors moved with the slow, fevered movements of the dying. Their skin was darkened by infection, their eyes sunken, their lips cracked and bleeding. The harbor master ordered the ships to anchor offshore, forbidden to dock. But it was too late. The disease had already begun its work, already making its way into the city of the Byzantine emperors, already beginning the transformation of the world. One man in particular would witness this arrival and write about it in terms that would echo across centuries. His name was John VI Cantacuzene, and he was the Byzantine emperor himself. His 13-year-old son had just fallen ill with the mysterious sickness that was spreading through Constantinople. The boy would be dead within days, one of countless children who would perish in the plague that was coming. In his later writings reflecting on this terrible time, the emperor would describe the plague in language modeled on the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, trying to impose order and logic on something utterly beyond comprehension. But his words, for all their classical precision, could not capture the reality of what was happening. Families being torn apart as parents fled from their own children, physicians refusing to visit the sick, the streets becoming rivers of human waste and despair. The first outbreak in Constantinople lasted a year, but the disease did not leave. It would return again and again, ravaging the city 10 more times before the century was out. Each time it would kill thousands. Each time it would leave the survivors forever changed, forever scarred by the knowledge of how fragile human life truly was. But Constantinople, terrible as its suffering was, would prove to be only the beginning. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys, the same ships or others carrying the same terrible cargo, arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The harbor bustled with activity, merchants unloading goods, nobles waiting for news of distant lands, laborers sweating in the Mediterranean sun. The ships were familiar sights, part of the great network of trade that connected the Christian Mediterranean world. But as the galleys drew near, the crowd on the dock noticed something wrong. The sailors who emerged from below decks looked like walking corpses. Some were covered in dark, reddish splotches. Others had grotesque swellings on their bodies. Several were so ill they had to be carried ashore on stretchers, already beyond hope of survival. Within days, the disease had spread from the docks into the city. Within weeks, it had infected the entire island. Bodies began to pile up faster than they could be buried. The sick, abandoned by their families in terror, lay in the streets, crying out for water, for mercy, for death to finally come and take them away. It was December 1347 when another galley arrived in Genoa, Italy, carrying the same invisible death. Within weeks, the disease had reached Venice, then Pisa, then spread northward into France with the relentless inevitability of water flowing downhill. By January 1348, plague had arrived in Marseilles. By June, it had swept through Spain and Portugal. By August, it had crossed the Channel to England, where it first landed at a small port in Dorset called Melcombe Regis. In a horrifyingly short time, the map of Europe was becoming a map of death. The disease spread faster than rumor, faster than any messenger could ride, as if it had a will of its own, as if it were alive and hunting. The horror of it was that no one understood what was happening. The finest physicians of Christendom gathered in their studies and laboratories, mixing herbs and consulting ancient texts, and they were utterly helpless. They believed in something called miasma, corrupt air that caused disease, and so they hung bundles of sweet-smelling herbs in their chambers as if they could somehow purify the very air around them. Some consulted the stars, believing that certain astrological conjunctions had caused the plague. Jupiter had aligned with Saturn in Aquarius. Surely this could not be coincidence. Surely the heavens themselves had marked this as a season of death. None of it mattered. None of it could save them. The disease itself was a nightmare incarnate. In its bubonic form, it began with a fever, an ordinary fever that seemed almost mild compared to what would come. The victim would feel aches in the joints, nausea, a general weakness spreading through the body like fog. Then, around the second or third day, the true horror would appear. In the groin, or under the armpits, or in the neck, great swellings would emerge, swellings as large as apples or eggs, turning black or deep purple, oozing pus and blood. A Florentine writer named Giovanni Boccaccio, who would witness the plague firsthand, would later describe these horrible growths with a precision that made his readers wince. In men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. As the gavocciolo had been and still was an infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves. After the swellings came the black spots, dark splotches that appeared on the arms, the thighs, anywhere on the body. They were like a mark of doom, a visual sentence of death that everyone recognized. A person covered in these spots was a walking corpse, already condemned. Most people died within 2 to 7 days of the first symptoms. Some died even faster, their bodies simply giving up in the face of the infection. But the bubonic form was not the only killer. A more dreadful version of the disease existed as well, a pneumonic plague that attacked the lungs and spread from person to person through the air itself. A person afflicted with pneumonic plague would cough, and with each cough, thousands of bacteria would spray into the air like invisible death itself. Their sputum would be tinged with blood, then bright red, then flowing freely from their mouths. The lungs would fill with fluid. Death would come within 2 days, sometimes faster. And the mortality rate, the percentage of those who contracted the disease and died, was nearly absolute. In the cities and towns of Europe, panic began to spread almost as quickly as the disease itself. In Florence, one of the greatest cities in Christendom, the plague arrived in 1348 and began its terrible work. The city's population, numbering perhaps 120,000 souls, began to die at an almost incomprehensible rate. One chronicle suggests that 80% of the city's population perished in a single year. 80%. 4 out of every 5 people simply gone, their bodies piling up faster than any system could handle. Graveyards filled, so did common pits. Then, when the pits were full, the dead were simply piled in the streets. Families abandoned one another in terror, parents fleeing from their own children, children running from parents. One man, an Italian chronicler named Agnolo di Tura, would later record his own experience. Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Agnolo would add with a voice of profound despair, a detail that captures the absolute collapse of all human dignity. I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. The institutions that had once held society together began to crumble. The church, which had promised salvation and the possibility of eternal life, seemed powerless against this earthly death. Priests who went to hear the confessions of the dying often caught the plague themselves and died alongside their flock. In some places, the clergy died faster than the general population, their constant contact with the sick making them particularly vulnerable. The Pope himself, safe in Avignon in France, watched in horror as his bureaucracy collapsed around him, as 1/4 of his court simply died. But religion, even in the face of this catastrophe, did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. If God was allowing this plague, if he was sending this death as punishment for the sins of mankind, then surely there must be a way to appease him. Surely if a person suffered enough, if they demonstrated enough repentance, they might be spared. In 1348 and 1349, a movement began in Austria and Hungary that would spread across Europe with the speed of the plague itself. They were called the Flagellants, men and women who believed that the only way to earn God's forgiveness was through public suffering and self-inflicted pain. Imagine a medieval town square crowded with people. The Flagellants would arrive, dozens or even hundreds of them, wearing white robes with red crosses marked upon them. They were led by a master, a man who had appointed himself the interpreter of God's will. And then, in the sight of all the gathered townspeople, they would begin. The masters would distribute whips, terrible instruments with knotted cords or leather thongs embedded with metal spikes. And then the Flagellants would begin to strike themselves over and over upon their bare backs and shoulders. They would sing hymns as they did so, prayers set to music, as blood ran down their sides and pooled on the cobblestones beneath their feet. The townspeople would watch in fascination and horror. Some would weep, others would join in, seizing whips and striking themselves alongside the Flagellants. The masters would call out, encouraging them to greater efforts, claiming that this suffering, this voluntary pain, was earning divine forgiveness for the plague, was earning the mercy of God, and for a time many people believed it. The flagellants traveled from city to city, drawing crowds, gaining followers, their processions growing larger and more fanatical. A contemporary chronicle described the scene. The master would strike one of the followers on the back and beg him to do penance, and he, dropping on the ground, would weep and beg the spectators to pray for him while he was beaten by the others. And when he rose up, he beat himself, and the others would strike one another with whips. It was madness, but it was a madness that seemed to offer something that nothing else could offer. Meaning, purpose, the possibility that this terrible death was not random or senseless, but part of a divine pattern, something that could be endured and eventually overcome. But the flagellants offered more than just spiritual comfort. They also offered someone to blame. If the plague was a punishment from God, then surely someone must have earned that punishment. And in the minds of many desperate, frightened people, one answer seemed obvious: the Jews. Medieval Europe had long harbored deep anti-Jewish prejudice, but now, in the crucible of the plague, that prejudice transformed into murderous hysteria. There was no evidence, none whatsoever, that Jews had poisoned the wells or caused the plague in any way. But logic was no match for fear, and so, beginning in 1348 and continuing for years, Jews across Europe were hunted down and murdered. In the city of Strasbourg in February 1349, more than 2,000 Jews were killed, many of them burned alive. In Mainz and Cologne, entire Jewish communities were annihilated, their members choosing mass suicide rather than surrender to their persecutors. By 1351, 60 major Jewish communities had been destroyed and 150 smaller ones. Thousands upon thousands of Jews were murdered, their only crime being that they were different, that they could be scapegoated, that the desperate, dying people of Europe needed someone to blame for the inexplicable catastrophe that was consuming them. As the plague raged on through 1348, 1349, 1350, and into 1351, it was not merely taking lives, it was reshaping the very foundations of European society. The old order, the feudal system that had endured for 800 years, was beginning to crack. Before the plague, the social structure of Europe had been rigid and unchanging. A peasant was born a peasant and would die a peasant. A noble was born to rule and would rule until death. The church stood above all, mediating between heaven and earth. The system worked because there was no alternative, because people had nowhere else to go. But the plague changed that. It killed the young and old, the weak and strong, with almost equal indifference. In some regions, it killed 60% of the population. In others, it killed 80%. Entire villages were depopulated, entire families extinct. And when the living emerged from the terror and began to count the survivors, they made a discovery that would reverberate through the centuries to come. There were no longer enough workers. In the fields of Europe, the crops began to rot in the ground because there were not enough hands to harvest them. In the cities, homes and shops stood empty because there was no one to occupy them. Servants and laborers became suddenly valuable. For the first time in living memory, a peasant could demand wages. A craftsman could choose which master to work for. The old certainties were shattered. In Florence, where detailed records survive, the wages of unskilled workers rose 87% between 1348 and 1350. Skilled workers saw their wages increase by 27%. Across Europe, the pattern was similar. Desperate nobles, watching their harvests rot in the fields and their estates fall into disrepair, were forced to negotiate with workers, creatures whom they had always viewed as little better than animals, suddenly transformed into essential, negotiable partners. Governments tried to fight back. In England, in 1349 and 1351, Parliament passed laws called the Ordinance of Labourers and the Statute of Labourers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But it was hopeless. You cannot legislate against the laws of supply and demand, not when the supply is being counted in body counts and mass graves. And so, slowly, the medieval order that had seemed eternal and unchangeable began to dissolve. Feudalism, the entire system of lords and vassals that had held Europe together, was becoming unsustainable. And from its ruins, something new was beginning to form. By 1353, almost miraculously, the plague began to abate. The disease did not disappear entirely. It would return again and again throughout the late medieval period and beyond, claiming victims in waves that seemed to follow no predictable pattern. But the worst of the initial catastrophe was passing. When the survivors emerged from their hiding places, when they buried the last of the uncounted dead and attempted to take stock of what remained, they found themselves in a world transformed beyond recognition. Entire villages had been permanently abandoned. One historian estimates that in Germany alone, nearly 40,000 settlements were destroyed or depopulated between 1347 and 1450, and most of them would never be reoccupied. The survivors were changed in ways that could not be undone. They had witnessed something that shattered the certainties of medieval life. They had seen the institutions that were supposed to protect them, the church, the nobility, the feudal order itself, utterly powerless in the face of disease and death. They had learned that survival was not guaranteed, that the world did not follow the rules that their fathers and grandfathers had believed in, and so they began to look for new answers. They began to question the authority of the church, the inevitability of feudalism, the idea that there was an unchanging, eternal order to the world. In time, this questioning would lead to the Renaissance, to a new way of thinking that emphasized the individual, the natural world, and the possibility of human progress. But all of that lay in the future. In 1353, what remained was simply the shock, the grief, the profound disorientation of a world that had nearly ended. Somewhere in Rome, a poet named Petrarch looked at the ruins of the classical world, at the death of so many of his friends and colleagues, and began to dream of a renaissance, a rebirth of ancient learning, a new golden age. Somewhere in Florence, artists and thinkers were beginning to wonder if perhaps beauty and art and human achievement were not sinful distractions from the spiritual life, but rather reflections of the divine order itself. And everywhere, ordinary people, survivors of the plague, witnesses to the apocalypse, were beginning to reclaim agency over their own lives, to recognize that they were not merely servants of an eternal order, but participants in history, shapers of their own destiny. The Black Death had killed nearly half the population of Europe. It had destroyed civilizations, erased entire lineages, made widows and orphans of millions. It had been, in every sense of the word, a catastrophe beyond measure. But in destroying the old world, it had also made possible the birth of something new. If you enjoyed today's return to the Middle Ages, I'd be truly grateful for your like. It's the best way to let me know that these stories are worth making. I'm already preparing another exciting story for you, so if you don't want to miss it, consider subscribing. I'll see you next week.